We're welcoming Sheila Cooke-Kayser, retired National Park Service educator and the chair of our 3rd grade History Week program here at the Danvers Historical Society. Ms. Kayser enjoys researching women's history, especially the remarkable women of the Page House. I'm looking forward to learning more about Dill. Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. As Laura said, I've been researching about the women connected to the Page House, and the one that I have found most fascinating has been the last person who lived in the Page House, and that was Anne L. Page. And she was born in 1828 and died in 1913. And as I was researching her life, I've come to find out that she was very active in the abolitionist movement. She was also a suffragette and would have meetings in her home with other women to demand the right to vote. And then she also was one of the pioneers of the kindergarten movement here in the United States. So I was trying to find anything that she might have written, and I came upon an article in the Danvers Historical Collections, and it was called The Story of Dill. And I started to read this article that she had written. It's only 2 or 3 pages, and thought I would find out more about her, but she was actually talking about another woman who had lived in the Page House, but had a very different life from the other women of the Page House. And this was a person who was enslaved, who had been purchased by her grandfather, Jeremiah Page, back in 1766. So in the article, she included what was a bill of sale, and this is a copy of that bill of sale. And it showed that on April 19th, 1766, Jeremiah Page paid 58 pounds, 13 shillings, and 4 pence, and also traded an enslaved woman he already owned named Dinah. And he traded them for 3 people, a woman named Combo, a young girl named Kate, and a child called Deliverance, or Dill would be her nickname. So this was a primary source that had been in the Page family and that Anne had knew about this bill of sale. But she also knew Dill later in life. When Anne was a young child, Dill by that time was a free woman living in Salem and had 2 grown daughters that Anne got to know. And she and her family, her father, John Page, and her mother, Mary, would often go to Dill's home in Salem to visit her, and sometimes she would still come to the Page House to visit them, because Anne's father, John Page, inherited the Page House after Jeremiah Page died in 1804. So this kind of intrigued me to learn more about Dill, and are there any other sources available about her. Anne did give us some basic information, but how was it like for this young child enslaved here in the colonies? We don't even know if she was born here in the colonies, or was she born in Africa and captured there and brought over with her family. We don't even know if Combo, the woman, and Kate, the young girl, are related to Dill as Combo, her mother, or as Kate, her older sister, and we don't know who her father is as well. So he purchases these 3 people and trades them also for Dinah to a man named John Tapley, who was also living here in Danvers. And I haven't been able to find out any information about Tapley when he purchased these people originally, before 1766. So to kind of understand Dill's life here in Danvers when she arrives at the Page House, a year after she's there, Combo and Kate unfortunately die, supposedly from the very cold winters. So this leaves this young child alone with this family, and they would be raising her, but also she's a servant. She's an enslaved person, and she would have to be helping Jeremiah's wife, Sarah, help take care of the house. One of the reasons Anne says that Jeremiah traded in Dinah for these 3 people was because Dinah was getting too old and she couldn't help Sarah. At this time, Sarah had had 7 children. She would eventually have 9 by 1768. So Dill is now probably being trained by Sarah to help take care of the household chores, but also to help take care of the children. And here she is. She's probably, we don't know how old she is, but described as a child. She may be 5 or 6 years old at the time. So she's helping to serve children older than her age, and younger than her as well. So to kind of understand about Dill as an enslaved person, you have to go back in time to when were the first enslaved people from Africa brought here to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that was in 1637. And it was on a ship called the Desire. And the ship was built in Marblehead and was owned by a bunch of Salem merchants. And actually the ship Desire left Salem in 1636, and part of the cargo at that time were 17 indigenous people who were enslaved. They were of the Pequot Nation, and it was after the Pequot Wars of 1635 and 1636. So they were put on this ship to be traded off, and they were going to sail to Bermuda, but they end up at a place called Providence Island, which was off the coast of Nicaragua. And at this time, Providence Island was a Puritan colony. And so they trade those 17 Pequot people, that was actually 2 women and 15 boys, for African enslaved people that are working on this island. We don't know how many, but by 1637, Desire arrives back to Massachusetts Bay Colony, and this is the first recording of enslaved people of African descent brought here to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So about 128 years later, you have Dill still enslaved, and she's part of about 5,400 people in Massachusetts who were enslaved at the time. And it's kind of hard to imagine that children and even babies would have been captured and enslaved here and brought to the colonies. This is part of an exhibit at the Lynn Museum called Unmasking and Evolution of the Negro Election Day, and the Black Vote exhibit that they have there right now. They gave me permission to photograph these shackles, so you have to remember that the enslaved people would have been wearing chains like this on their ankles. And this also shows a photograph of a 12-year-old enslaved girl and the paperwork that went with her. So Dill arrives here at the Page House. This is an old photograph of the Page House in the 1890s. And again, as I said, she's now, a year later, she's the only enslaved person in the home. And it's hard to imagine what life was like for her, but you have to kind of look at life from other enslaved people and what they wrote about it later. But you have to wonder, at what point does Dill realize that she's property and she doesn't have the same rights and privileges as the other children in the household that she's helping to take care of? And does she have any interaction with other enslaved people in Danvers? In a 1754 tax record, there were 21 adult enslaved people here in Danvers. They didn't count the children in it. And then by 1757, Danvers is actually incorporated as separated. It used to be part of Salem Village, and now it becomes Danvers. And you had a population of about 2,140 people. So 21 adults are identified as enslaved, so it's about 10% of the population. So when you look at this map of Danvers in 1820, it's showing the center of town, and that is where Jeremiah Page's house used to be on Elm Street. Now it was moved here after the Historical Society purchased it, and it's on a street we now call Page Street. But so they're in the center of town, so would they have sent Dill out on errands, and maybe she had met other enslaved people living here in Danvers? One of the places where they would have met would have been in the church. So the people, the white colonists, believed that their enslaved people should be Christians, so they would have taken them to church, in the first church in Danvers. This is a drawing of it in 1770. So you have the enslaved people joining the families, their enslavers, to attend this church, and they, of course, would have been sitting up in the balcony. Was this an opportunity for these people to talk to one another and talk about how might they become free, or talk about their daily lives? But one of the things they start to hear these white colonists complain about are taxes in the 1760s into the 1770s, of course. was the British government was trying to pay off the French and Indian War. They won it, but it cost a lot of money. So they're passing various taxes to raise revenue, and many of the colonists are protesting these taxes, including Jeremiah Page. So one of the phrases that they would have heard from these white colonists in their homes, or even outside their homes, was they are slaves to the British Empire. So this might sound ironic to the people who are truly enslaved here at the time, but it did give some of them encouragement to think, well, maybe we will become free too if we help them to fight against the British government. And this encouraged several enslaved people in Massachusetts to file what were called freedom suits, where they would take their masters to court and sue for their freedom. They didn't win all the time, but there are a few cases where people did win the freedom suits. So, of course, these protests would lead into the American Revolution, and you would have the first battle April 19th, 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and Jeremiah Page is a captain of one of the militias, so he would go off to fight in that. And then a couple of months later, you had the Battle of Bunker Hill. In both those battles, there were enslaved men, there were free blacks, and also indigenous men who fought in those battles. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, you have two images here. There were about 100 men who were enslaved, free blacks, indigenous, that fought at Bunker Hill, including these two men who are the most well-known, Salem Poor and Peter Salem, both fought at that battle. Eventually, here in Danvers, there would be 13 men who would sign up in a list to fight in the American Revolution, including Primus Jacobs, Thomas Simmons, and Frederick Fortune as well. And so you would have a group of men here in Danvers who would go off to fight in the Revolution. Sometimes they're still enslaved people, and they might be taking the place of their masters to fight in the war with the promise that they would be given freedom once the war was over. When the war ends and we become the United States, here in Massachusetts, you still had a lot of people who were filing those freedom suits, demanding their freedom even more, once they learned that in the Massachusetts Constitution it says all men are born free and equal. One of the people who won a freedom suit that actually helped to lead to the abolishment of slavery here in Massachusetts was this woman here, Elizabeth Freeman. Elizabeth Freeman lived in Western Mass, and she was also, like Dill, enslaved as a child. And when she became an adult, she was beaten quite often by the woman who owned her. So she was able to hook up with an abolitionist lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick, and he helped to win her case, and she became free. She was called Mum Bet when she was enslaved, and she changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman. As I said, her suit helped to lead to the abolishment of slavery here in Massachusetts. But not all the people who were enslaved would learn about this, and sadly, some of the enslavers who owned these people sold them off quickly. They sold them to people in Canada and the West Indies, so they wouldn't lose their money. But those who ended up staying here, it was estimated there were about 5,400 enslaved people in Massachusetts at this time. And we don't know with Dill, some enslaved people stayed with the people that they were living with, their enslavers, because they didn't know where else to go. It was hard to get jobs, be allowed to work and get paid. Sometimes maybe the people who owned them before started to offer them wages and promise them wages, but sometimes didn't ever pay them for their labor. So we don't know when Dill actually leaves the Page house, but we do know that she ends up in Salem. And we go back to Anne's article that she wrote and find out that Anne gave us several clues, because Anne didn't know her later in life. And Anne talks about that she was Mrs. Simmons. She lived on North Street in Salem. She was a member of the St. Peter's Episcopal Church, and that she had two grown daughters, Anstis, and that was her nickname. She was called Nancy, and her nickname was Anstis, and another daughter named Hannah. And by the time Anne knows her, Dill is probably in her late 50s or 60s years old, and she actually has grandchildren at the time. Hannah ends up having 5 children, and Anne would talk about knowing 3 of Hannah's sons. So once we got to this stage, I realized that I needed help. So I reached out to friends and local historians that I knew to help me research more about the family. And one of the people who was helping me was a friend named Jean Montiel, who's very good at Ancestry.com. And so Jean started to research taking the name Simmons and also Nancy's name and Hannah's name, and we eventually would find out their married names, so she was able to look through Ancestry.com to try to trace these people. Then I had contacted the Salem Public Library, and the reference librarian helped me, and she found something quite amazing. She found that Aunt Dill had actually been married before she married Andrew Simmons, and that in 1791 she found a record for Dill Page marrying a London Rudloff at the time. Here you see Salem Vital Records, and you can see where we have one arrow on the right side, you'll see London Rudloff, and it's spelled several different ways. And then you have Dilly Page, and February 5th, 1791, they both got married at that time. And then if you look on the left side, these are records of children that have been born, and you start to find that Dill and London Rudloff actually end up having 4 sons. And they are listing their baptism records. So if you go to James Rudloff, London Rudloff, and Louis Rudloff, they're all baptized on the same day, May 14, 1797. But London is the oldest one. He's 6 years old, and James is 3 years old, and Louis is probably a year old. Then if you go up above there, you'll see David Rudloff, and he was born in 1800, so that's their last child. So now we have this amazing part of Dill's story that Anne never knew about, and that she'd been married before she married Andrew Simmons, and she'd have 4 sons at the time. So this led us to try to look up these names. So June started to research them, and then another friend of mine named Beth Bauer started to research them as well. And one of the things we started to find is that we knew that she was part of St. Peter's Episcopal Church. And I found out from Susan Speck that those records are at the Phillips Library owned by the Peabody Essex Museum. So I was able to make an appointment with them to look at the church records, which they have. But at the same time, I also found something else at the Phillips Library, and that was that they had a journal by Anne that was written in the 1890s. And I was able to look at this journal, and it was mostly a journal about Anne's family, and she was writing it for her nieces and nephews. Anne never got married and didn't have children, so it sounded like that her nieces and nephews had asked her to write about her family history. But surprisingly, within this journal, I found 6 pages that talked about Dill and gave us a bit more information, because this is where she also talks about that after Dill died in 1850, that Anne kept in touch with her daughters, Anstis and Hannah, and actually knew that 2 of Hannah's sons, Andrew and Edward, had moved to California. So we were even able to trace them to California, and they had started living out there in the 1880s. So we start to look into the church records, and I was trying to find where in the church records would be the marriage of Dill and London Rudloff, and I found that. I found the birth records or baptism records of their sons, and then I find out that in 1804, London Rudloff died. And also he was identified as a mariner, so this was another piece of evidence that now we know he sailed on ships. Then I found the record showing Andrew Simmons and Dilly Page, and the recorder for these church records would identify the people if they were black or African. And so here you see in April 22nd, 1805, Andrew Simmons and Dilly Page. It's kind of interesting that she's not using her married name, Rudloff, or the recorder knew her more as Dilly Page, listing them as getting married at that time. And then I was able to find birth records for their oldest daughter, Nancy, who was born in 1807, and then Hannah, who was born in 1809 as well. So this is the only photograph we have of
any of Dill's children, and this is Anstis, probably taken in the 1860s. And the photograph probably was owned by Ann Page. We do find it in a book that was written in the 1890s about the American Revolution, and Brown, who wrote the book, had interviewed Ann Page and wrote a whole chapter on Dill. So maybe Ann loaned him this photograph to use in his article. As we start to research, now that we have the names of London Rudolph, we have the names of the sons they had, we also have Andrew Simmons, and we also find when Hannah marries, she marries a William Fowler, and that she has 5 children. Her oldest was a daughter who sadly died when she was a year old, but she has 4 sons. And we start to see all these men identified in various records, Salem Vital records, and also U.S. Census records as mariners. So Jean started to research crew lists, and we start to find that 11 men in the family, including Anstis, ends up being married 3 times, and each husband was a mariner. And we start to find that they sailed on it all together. If you add up all the voyages, they did about 40 different Salem vessels and did probably more than 60 voyages. The only person we couldn't find crew lists for was London Rudolph Sr., Dill's first husband, and that might be because the time period he would be sailing before he died in 1804, they really weren't doing crew lists that much. So the first crew list we find is for their son, London Rudolph Jr., when age 14. This is a year after his father dies. He has a stepfather now, Andrew Simmons. And in 1805, he sailed on the schooner called the Saucy Jack, and they were heading to France. And he is listed as a cabin boy. So when these black men would try to get jobs, it was difficult to find any jobs that they would be allowed to have. But one of them was to be a cook on the ship. So they would be identified in all records as mariners, but their job on board was either as a cook or a steward. Then we find London Rudolph at age 24. He is on the ship called the George, which was actually owned by Joseph Peabody. And Joseph Peabody is connected to Danvers in Salem, became a wealthy merchant, and he bought Glen Magna Farms during the War of 1812. And in 1819, he owns this ship called the George. And we find London Rudolph not only on this voyage, but on several voyages listed as the cook. We also find his brother, James Rudolph, starts to go to sea as a young boy too. And we find that he's a cook on several ships, including the George on several voyages as well. Then we find Hannah's husband, William Fowler. This is 1847, when he's a cook and steward on the bark Angola. It's hard to read, but what's interesting with this crew list is their oldest son, Andrew, is on this voyage as well. He's 15 years old, and he's the cabin boy. We do find also that their son, William Fowler Jr., enlisted into the Navy in 1863 to fight in the Civil War, and he ends up, after the war, he survives, and he ends up in Brooklyn, New York, living there. We don't have any photographs or images of these men as mariners, but this is a black sailor named Jim that I found. I got permission from the Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., and they have this on exhibit. So they might have been dressed like this. It might be more of a naval uniform that William Fowler Jr. would have worn during the Civil War. One of the other things that was interesting, so you kind of wonder, as mariners, there are not many jobs available to these men and to black women. And so how much money what are they making? It's hard, sometimes you don't see what wages they're making. But London Rudolph Sr. is making enough money that in 1798, he buys property in half of a house. And we know this because of this deed that was found by Beth Bauer. And it's very exciting to see that here is a black man who is free. He's a mariner, and he makes enough money for his family that he pays $155 for property which is on North Street and half of a house. The other half of the house is bought by another black mariner named James Wilson. It also also says in the deed that London already owns property adjacent to this property. So he's already has owned some other land, and now he has his house. So this matches up with Ann saying that Dill lived on North Street, because from the description of the land in this deed, we know it ends up on North Street. Then we start to look at U.S. Census records, and we find a map of Salem in 1820, and where the red arrow is approximately where their property would have been. Today, that would be around 190, 198 North Street, right near St. Mary's Cemetery. But back then, the address was 140. They changed the numbers on this North Street later on. But in all the census records, it's identified as 140 North Street. So then you start to find records of the family, the U.S. Census records in 1810. She's married to Andrew Simmons. It shows only his name, although Dill is the one who owns the property, because when London dies, there's a probate will, and Dill is the executor, and she inherits the house and the property. And at that time, she starts to not call herself Dill anymore. You find in those records that her name is now spelled Delia, D-E-L-I-A. And she's not able to write her name at this time because she marks it with an X and somebody else writes her name. But we do know in 1819, Andrew Simmons dies. And we don't know if it was from a voyage that he was on, but in the church records, it just said he died of a common illness they described as dropsy. And then we find that now Anna, Anstis, and Hannah do go to a school, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but we do find the records that James Ruloff is now a grown man, 1837. He's living at 31 North Street. This is a city directory, it doesn't give the address, but we also see that his older brother, London Ruloff, is also a mariner, and this time he's living in another area where a lot of black families were living called Mill Street. We do know in 1790 census that the population of Salem was about 4,500 people, and that only about 120, 130 people are identifying themselves as black. And then by 1850, the population explodes to 22,000, and at that time there's almost 400 black people living in Salem. This is because, of course, this is going through the golden age of Salem when the maritime trade is exploding. And it would explain why a lot of these men who are part of this particular family become mariners, because that was one of the few jobs you could get at the time. This is a 1850 census, and Delia's still alive at that time. And we find that at 140 North Street, it shows Delia Simmons, then it shows her son-in-law, William Fowler, and then it shows her daughter, Hannah, and then we see the children, Andrew, William, and Edward, and another son, David, who later passed away, are listed. What's also interesting, London Ruloff married twice. His first wife died, but his second wife, he was Ruth Blanchard, and they have one child. They have a daughter, Sloane, who's born in 1831. And she's the only one of Dill's 6 grandchildren who will have children and later descendants. And this is an 1850 census record on the right side, and it shows David Fuller, who was Salome's husband. So you see David Fuller, you see Salome, you also see the names of their older children. You see Josephine, and you see David as well, and then Ruth Rudolph below that. So they end up having 11 children, and 4 of those 11 children have children, and that's why we have living descendants today. To try to understand what life was like for the people who were black at the time, they are free now in Massachusetts, but you do have a lot of dangers, especially for men who would have gone off to sea. One of the dangers was the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed Southerners to come up and capture people who were runaway slaves and force them back to slavery in the South. And this was a federal law, so a lot of people federal agents had to obey it. Local law enforcement did, but you did have The abolitionist movement is growing here in the New England, and especially here in Essex County. And so you have those people being involved. But it's a gradual, what historians call a gradual emancipation. This historian, Jared Hardesty, has written a book called Black Lives, Native Lands, and White Worlds. And in his book, he talks about at the end that once these people became free here in Massachusetts, it didn't automatically, of course, open the doors for them, that they would be not really treated free and equal, and that they would be segregation laws passed, they wouldn't be allowed to do certain things. There'd be limitation on jobs they would allow these people to have because of being in competition with other white people and their jobs. So as I mentioned now, we know mariners, you also know some people set up catering. The Ramon family of Salem were a very successful catering family. And then you have seamstresses, you have, of course, domestic servants, you have gardeners, and people working on the docks as well as sailing on ships. So how they were treated is you have to go again to people's personal perspectives of their life as a free black person. We don't have any letters or journals that belong to Delia, but we do know from Anne that she wrote poetry. And there were 2 verses of a poem she wrote that Anne included in her article. And this is her poem here. The minister, he stands in the pulpit and tells us from the Bible that we all must die. They stole us from Africa, the home of the free, and brought us in bondage across the blue sea. So it gives you a little perspective of what she thought about that. She's still probably not very happy or content with the fact that she was stolen from Africa. Of course, we don't know if she was born in Africa or was she born here, but she knows that that is her homeland. Her poetry reminded me of another poet, Phyllis Wheatley, who was also enslaved as a child, about the same time as Dill was. Phyllis arrived here in 1761 on a ship called the Phyllis, and so the Wheatley family named her after the ship she was on. She was showed immediately that she was a very smart young girl, and she was taught to read and write, so she ends up writing poetry and has a book of poems published by 1773 while she's still enslaved. Finally, Phyllis Wheatley is given her freedom and marries a man named John Peters. So you have to turn to other people who have written about what it was like to be enslaved, and also what it was like once you were in an area where you could be free in terms of competition for jobs and how you were treated by other white people. And one of them, of course, is the one who's very famous, Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery from Maryland and came up here to New Bedford and became an abolitionist speaker. And Douglass, one of the jobs he was skilled in was caulking ships, and he tried to get a job as a caulker in New Bedford, but they refused to hire him because they told him that the white caulkers wouldn't work. So he ended up having to shovel coal at half the price. Another person who was enslaved and became free here in Massachusetts was this gentleman here, Prince Hall, and he helped, he was the founder of the African Masonic Lodge here in the United States. Prince Hall stated this quote when he was speaking at one of those Masonic Lodge meetings. "Patience, I say, for were we not possessed of a great measure of it, we could not bear up under the daily insults we meet within the streets of Boston, much more on public days of recreation. How at such times are we shamefully abused, and that to such a degree that we may truly be said to carry our lives in our hands, and the arrows of death are flying about our heads." One of the things that people constantly were fighting for was education for their children. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that Estes and Hannah did go to school, but they went to an African-American school that started in 1807. The Phillips Library has only 2 school rosters from this school that sadly ended in 1827. And we were fortunate to find Hannah Simmons and Estes Simmons listed as students of this school. And Hannah is 16 and Estes is 17. The next year, the school would sadly end. didn't have enough money to keep the school going, to pay the school mistress to keep working there. And so they had to keep fighting to be allowed to go to the Salem public schools where they're white children. And it wasn't until 1844 that Salem integrated the schools. And in fact, Salem was the first city in Massachusetts to integrate schools. Also, you had, as I mentioned, you had the abolitionist movement happening here in Massachusetts. You would have white and black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass speaking. You would have the Ramon family are very active in this. Two of their children, Charles and Sarah, went around on the circuit to give lectures to abolish slavery. And you had organizations started in 1834. You had the Female Anti-Slavery Society, and in Salem, they had their own organization. They had their own branch of this. And this is a pamphlet from a lecture they were giving at the time. So what this Female Anti-Slavery Society would do would have fairs, craft fairs, and they would sell food and craft products to raise money to provide food, shelter, and clothing to any fugitive slaves who ended up in Massachusetts area. We don't know if Delia might have been part of this society, maybe her daughters belonged to it, because there are black and white women who are part of this anti-slavery society in the area. When Dill dies in 1850, Anne says that she and her mother attended Delia's funeral and that her father had passed away before then, and that other members of the Page family attended the funeral, and that it was well attended by many people in the community. So it kind of shows the respect that Delia had. We don't have anything in writing or any records to show what part she played at St. Peter's Episcopal Church, but we do find her still listed as a member and donating money to the church through the years until she died in 1850. This is a probate of Delia's will, where she leaves all her property, which is the house and the land that she owns and her furnishings, and she leaves them to her 3 living children at the time. London Ruloff had died in 1839. So James, Anstis, and Hannah are the 3 surviving children. She doesn't mention her grandchildren, so we don't know why Salome is not mentioned, but she doesn't mention Hannah's sons as well in this probate. So she dies in 1850, and the next thing we were able to find was on the find the grave, and we were able to find that she is buried in Greenlawn Cemetery, along with her daughter and one of her sons, James. So the gravestone's interesting because it not only mentions Delia Simmons and that she died in November 1850, and they also state that she's 84 years old, which is interesting because that would mean she was born in 1766, but we know from the bill of sale she's a young child in 1766, so she probably was born in 1761 or 62, which would make her a little bit older, maybe 89 or 90 years old. But also on this gravestone is her daughter, Hannah, who died in 1869. So probably, from what I can learn from Greenlawn Cemetery staff, is that families might later add the gravestone when they could afford it. So maybe then they added the gravestone after Hannah died, and they included Delia Simmons. We don't know if they're actually buried here. It's not in the data records for the cemetery. But right next to them is James Ruloff, who died in 1874. And then Anstis is the last of the children to pass away. She dies in 1877. And she still owns the house along with her nephews, because James left his part of the estate to his 3 living nephews at the time, which were Hannah's son. And by this time, Andrew and Edward are living in California, and William Ruloff dies in 1879. So the property ends up with Andrew and Edward and to Anstis, and then when she passed away, it all goes to them. And they probably sold it off. We're not sure who they sold it to. So as we were able to find out with this one grandchild, Salome, that she had 11 children, and then we were able to trace that 4 of those 11 children have children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren. We started to be able to connect to her living descendants, which was quite amazing. I never thought we would reach that level. But one of the descendants, Alice, had some great family photographs, and she sent me this photograph a few weeks ago, and I got so excited looking at this photograph dated 1902 on August Head, which is in Marblehead. And it shows a family outing, and what's amazing about it is the woman who's, of course, most of them are wearing white dresses, but there's the woman in the middle, it says Salome. And so this is Delia's granddaughter, Salome. And she's surrounded by grandchildren and one of her daughters, Alice. And Alice is in the white dress off to the right and has the name Mother on her. And right behind Alice is one of her oldest son, Bob. Behind Bob is also his brother, Charles. And then off to the left side of the picture, you see a gentleman, and that's George, Alice's husband, and they've written father on him. Behind Salome is another woman named Alice, and that's actually Bob's wife, and she is holding their oldest child, George. And then you have another daughter, Carrie, who's leaning her elbow on her father. And then you have another daughter, Alice, named after her mother, and she's sitting between her mother and Salome. I don't know who the young woman is sitting in front of George, the father, and the name is Rita Young. I haven't been able to trace if she's a relative or a friend, and I don't know who the other women are in the photograph. But it was very exciting to finally see names that we've been dealing with, facts that we had on these people, and actually see put faces to the facts. The next few slides will show you our other family photos that other family members, Alice and some others, sent me, which shows different members of the family. But I also wanted to identify the people who've helped me do all the research, and that includes Jean Montiel, who did the Ancestry.com, Beth Bauer, who's a historian and archivist who's researching African Americans who have sailed on Salem ships, and she's also researching African Americans who fought in the American Revolution. Susan Spack, at Reference Librarian at Salem Public Library, Richard Trask, archivist and historian, Peabody Institute Library in Danvers, John Frailer, retired National Park Service historian, and National Park Rangers Dan Cagnon and Merrill Cole-Hoffer. As we look at the descendants and photographs that the family has sent us, I want to read a poem by a poet named Hannah Drake. And Hannah is actively working with people, artists in Kentucky, where she lives, and they're uncovering the lives and stories of enslaved people in Kentucky. So she wrote this poem as part of a New York Times article about her, and I contacted her and got permission to read this for my talk. Can I find pieces of your memory in cotton fields and red mud, scattered bones to erase you from history? But you are here, you are always here. You existed, unknown, no longer. I found your name, I found you, and in finding you, I found me. Delia Woodloff Simmons was not considered important in Danvers history. She did not do anything particularly outstanding, but her life story was one of perseverance and a will to succeed against all odds. She maintained her dignity throughout her long life and earned the respect of many people in her community. In that way, her life is important, and we tell her story as a vital and important part of Danvers, Salem, and Essex County history. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I'll take questions in the chat.
I've just unmuted. We had one question came in on the chat, which I'm going to read now. Sheila, you probably can pull it up too, but you mentioned Elizabeth Friedman earlier in your presentation, and Whitney Cook asked, is she related to the one who lived in Walden Pond? You know?
I don't know. The only thing I know about Elizabeth Freeman is the little bit I've found on the internet and from the Elizabeth Freeman Center
I do know she lived in Stockbridge after she gained her freedom. She actually moved to the town where her lawyer lived, Sedgwick. And she made enough money. She actually ended up working for him as a domestic servant and was able to buy her own home. And that's where she died, in Stockbridge. They're supposed to be, she did marry and have children, but I don't know much more about her beyond that.
Okay, the next question is from Carrie McBride. If you could have one dream archival find related to Dill, what would it be?
If you could find, what was that again? If you could what?
If you could have one dream archival find related to Dill, what would it be?
It would be to find anything written by her. If there was, I mean, that's the sad part of trying to research enslaved people, is trying to find something in their writing. We have the fortunate Prince Hall, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, people like that, who did learn to read and write and wrote about their lives. But to actually find something that she wrote, especially about her personal life, because it's hard to get a full picture of her. You have that description that Anne gave of her, of being this tall woman who would wear these colorful turbans. I don't think I mentioned it, but she was known for being a very good cook and made supposedly delicious gingerbread cookies. But the only thing we have in her hand is something she wrote, was that poem that I showed earlier.
Next question is from Julie Curtis. Is Beth Bauer working at Salem State?
She used to, she's retired now. I think she joined us tonight. She might could answer that.
Okay, and Terry Washington asked, how long did it take to do the research? When did you and the team start?
I read the article about 8 years ago, and I did a little bit of research then, but basically it became almost a pandemic project. I started to really focus on it and started to do the research. And then when I contacted Jean, who helped me tremendously and was giving her some of the names I knew. And then when I contacted Susan at the Salem Public Library, and she found in the Salem Vital Records, because at that point, that's when COVID first hit and I couldn't go to the library. So it took a while before I could get to the Phillips Library. So it's taken basically, I would say, the last three years or so to really do this in-depth research on her. And there's so much more to find out more now that we're starting to find information on her grandchildren, great-grandchildren as well.
Okay, we have a comment and question from James Tanzer. Thank you for sharing Dill's story and the story of her family. Were you able to find any early records of Dill in the Danvers Congregational Church records?
No, I just was at the Danvers archive last week, and I was trying to see if she's mentioned in there. So Richard Trask pulled out, there is a church record for First Church. I found Rose, who was the child who was bought right off the ship when she was a baby by Stephen Putnam, and that she was baptized there, but I couldn't find any mention of Dill.
And a comment by Julie Curtis. Sad fact is the reason Dill was purchased was the original woman was sold because she was too old to be any good.
According to Anne, and Anne is, when I find Anne's journal, I find out more information about who's telling Anne all this story. So it's Anne's older aunts who were teenagers at the time when Dill comes to be at the family as enslaved. So I don't know what happened to Dinah. According to Anne, Dinah was getting too old to help take care of the children. So she is part of the trade. So she ends up becoming part of the sale and goes to John Tapley. I haven't been able to find much about John Tapley himself. And I started trying to find anything on Dinah. According to a woman, Harriet Tapley, who was a well-known historian here in Danvers. In fact, Tapley Hall is named after her, and that's where we are tonight. Harriet mentioned that when John Tapley died, but she didn't say when, that Dinah was still alive and became a ward of the town. They had to come up with money to take care of her.
Thank you. The next is a comment by Battle Posley. I just want to thank Sheila for finding me on Facebook and reaching out to me, allowing me to notify my aunt, cousin, and sister. And this is signed by Michael Battle, son of Edward and Amelia.
Great.
And are there any other questions? That's all I'm seeing right now. If anyone else has any, please enter them. Okay, here we go. One more. Terry Washington asked, how much of your research was done using the internet? I'm guessing most of your work was done in person.
A lot was done through Ancestry.com with Jean's work that she did. Other things, I'm not sure where Beth Bauer found the deed. She's done a lot of research as well, a lot of it online. Fortunately now, a lot of historical societies, the Massachusetts Historical Society are putting a lot of things on the internet, so you're able, and of course the Library of Congress. One thing I did want to mention is the National Park Service just funded for Essex County an annotated guide about African Americans in Essex County. And this is a recent project, and the guide just came out on the website. If you go to the Salem Maritime National Historic Site website, you can look it up. And what they did, they went around Essex County to a lot of the resources, libraries, historical societies, any archives, to see what was there, resources, primary sources, secondary sources that would tell you about African Americans. I was watching a Zoom last week by the Massachusetts Historical Society, and it was really interesting. They had three people from three different historical societies and organizations. And one of the things that came across, and they stress, and I'll stress it too, is that this, to find where it is, you have to go through a lot of different resources to find. When I found that Journal of Anne page at the Phillips Library, it's about that thick, that one. When I read through it, of course, you're reading it in her own handwriting, which was not easy to read. But what I ended up doing was taking photographs of every page, and then I came home and tried to transcribe it. And that's when I found she had about 5 or 6 pages where she talked about Dill. And then I did go to the Phillips Library and had to go through all of those church records. And I just went through several based on time period to try to see if I could find Dill's name, her husband's names, the children's under. Fortunately, although it's sad to say, when the church recorder is writing these people's names at that time, and of course they're spelling the Rudliff name is spelled 5 or 6 different ways, and I don't even know what the correct spelling is. They also would put, after anyone who was of African descent, they would write African or Black.
Okay, if you have opened the chat at the bottom of the page, you see these conversations. Laura has listed the website for Uncovering Black History. And also Beth Bauer has entered on here that the South Essex Registry of Deeds has all the deeds online. Go to the salemhistorical.org and look at the resources page on doing research. There is a link, or search on the Southern Essex Registry itself. And a couple of other hints I've got for, and there's some more coming, but Sheila mentioned Ancestry.com, genealogy.com also has a family history blog where you can look up a family name, and very often there'll be a whole list of blogs and questions that people, family members have put up that you can log into and maybe pick up some hints there. Another site is findagrave.com, which if someone is buried, well, basically anywhere in the world almost now, if someone has entered a picture of their gravestone, you can find it online. So that's also another place you can sometimes get news. Okay, and Marianne Zajewski, I hope I didn't mispronounce that, Gave another website, articles on African Americans, Nestor County, which is online.
I had known about those guys because I would have included them in all of my programs. I would have made every ranger on my staff talk about these people. So I'm hoping that this is something that people who work at Salem Maritime will use this information as well. But one of the things I would like to do is maybe in the spring when it's warmer to do an outside program on Derby Wharf at Salem Maritime and talk a little bit about the voyages that those 11 men went on. It would be great to try to find more research, see if we could find out any more about London Rodloff, her first husband, and if it's any way possible to find out what ships he was on. So I think it's interesting when you're researching somebody's life, you start to find other information, and then you want to go, well, I want to go research that. But then you have to pull yourself back in and go, okay, let's be focused, which was kind of hard to do for this talk tonight. I was trying to keep it as focused as I could. I'm used to giving a tour where I'm walking around and I have a historic site I'm talking about. So it's a little different to do the Zoom. As you could see, I didn't know what I was doing at the beginning when I was trying to get the PowerPoint to work. But I think there's many other stories to tell connected to this one family.
If anybody else has any other questions, type them in and we'll try to answer them. We did have a few other people earlier on in the chat say thank you for the great presentation. And I will echo that. This was fantastic and very interesting. Even if I'm not a member of the family, it's great to hear about some of our history and the fact that our pilgrim ancestors who were so righteous that they came here for religious freedom still killed people for witchcraft and thought they could own other people. And it's unfortunate that these sort of things happened. Fortunately, we've risen above that, but I think we still, as a member of the Diversity Committee, or Human Rights and Inclusion Committee now, I should call it, I know we've still got a long way to go to learn to be equal and treat everybody the way we'd like to be treated. But I think this is a good lesson on and again, thank you, Sheila, for a very fascinating program, and we really appreciate it.
I just want
Thank
to
you all for
point out,
attendance, and someone else just totes the list.
I just want to point out one thing before everybody gets off, because we have a few descendants who join us tonight, which is very exciting for me personally. But I have put together a reference of all the resources we use to find out this story about this family. So if you want that reference, you can email the Historical Society and we'll be happy to send that to you as well. So thank you myself for everyone who joined tonight, including friends of mine far away and even a few relatives. So thank you for joining tonight.
I had another comment from Jane. Great job. Very impressed with how thorough your research is. Thank you for all your hard work. I know how hard and tedious that can be, and how often you find yourself going down rabbit holes that lead to dead ends. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And Laura says she will email everyone when the information is available. And thank you again for coming. And D. Joko says thank you very much. And Alice Giro says thank you for the great work you did.
Thank you.
So thank you, and everyone have a good evening and enjoy the warm weather we're supposed to be having. Okay, we will stay open for a few more minutes. If anybody has any other questions, they can type them in. Thank you. And just a reminder, the Danvers does have a speaker event the third Wednesday of every month, and they're usually very interesting programs about local history of people who've lived in Danvers and their impact in the world. So keep an eye out on our events page and see what's happening. And hopefully we'll be able to have live events face-to-face again sometime soon. If this pandemic ever eases up, let's just keep our fingers crossed on that. So everyone enjoy the warm weather, be safe and be healthy and stay warm. Okay, unless anyone else has any other questions, then I guess we'll probably sign off. And everyone have a great weekend and be well. Thank you. And thank you, Sheila.
Y'all have a good night. Bye, cousin.
Bye, cousin. Bye, Mom. Bye, David, and everybody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sheila.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, further information on research, please contact danvershistory.org, dhs@danvershistory.org is the email. And here we are going to tack on a previously recorded Zoom Q&A session that accompanies this video. Thank you again, Sheila.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for spending time at the Danvers Historical Society today. Please be sure to visit our website, www.danvershistory.org, and you can donate there as well. Thank you for coming and have a nice day.